7. F4U-1 Corsair. Bob Jarrett from the classic Jets Fighter Museum, CJFM, first laid eyes on his F4U-1 Corsair in 1987. The aircraft was situated in a saltwater lake on an island in the South Pacific, in a place that's known today as the nation of Vanuatu. On May 5, 1944, the Corsair's pilot, U.S. Marine Captain James Vitito, had to make an emergency landing on the lake. He was returning from an extended training mission, but he ran out of fuel just a short distance from his home base at Quan Hill. Vitito survived the war and the plane crash and lived until 1994. The wrecked Corsair plane was a well-known tourist attraction for many years, even though it suffered heavily from both vandalism and the elements in the decades following the war. When Bob Jarrett looked into acquiring the wreck in 2009, the aircraft was examined. Apparently, the Corsair had started to deteriorate past the point of return, the main fuselage had been cut away at some point, leaving the completely corroded engine and the plane's wing in the water. The recovery of the Corsair was no easy task. In order to float it back to shore, the plane's 40-foot wings had to be disassembled into 3 pieces. According to Jarrett, all of the wing fold hinges were rusted underwater, so one at a time, each wing was carefully lifted onto a bush tripod, as well as lifting blocks to keep them out of the water. Then CJFM's team cut through each wing with their oxy equipment, and they were separated into 3 individual sections. After each piece was floated ashore, they were able to thoroughly clean the wings over the next couple of months. Later, the wing pieces were transported to Afate, where they were then loaded into a shipping container. After their export permits were cleared and they reached an agreement with the landowner, the 40-foot shipping container was sent to Adelaide, South Australia. From there, it was finally shipped to the Classic Jets Fighter Museum, where restoration work began immediately. Unfortunately, CJFM closed its doors in 2019, but Jarrett is still apparently in possession of the Corsair, according to an article published on warburnsnews.com in January of 2020. The man is apparently continuing the restoration work on the aircraft in a hangar that's adjacent to his now closed museum. That seemed to be the last update regarding this specific Corsair, so it's unclear if the plane has been fully restored or not. 6. Ancient Viking Sword. In October 2018, an amazing artifact was uncovered in Vidostern Lake in Småland, Sweden by an 8-year-old girl. The girl, Saga Vanacek, was out swimming in the lake near her home when she stepped on something in the water that she didn't recognize initially. When she felt around on the bottom of the lake, she found what she'd stepped on. When she pulled her discovery out of the water, she realized that she was actually gripping the handle of what seemed to be an ancient sword. Saga was naturally intrigued by her discovery, so she took it home to show her father. However, he had a hard time identifying what he was looking at, so they showed the sword to some local experts at the Jönköpingslands Museum. The museum staff were utterly amazed at the relic the 8-year-old had discovered. According to Mikael Nordstrom from the museum, it's not every day that one steps on a sword in a lake. Experts immediately recognized that the weapon was extremely significant. When the sword was first dated, it was believed to be 1,000 years old, from the era of the Vikings. However, after a team of experts completed further investigation of the artifact, they claimed it was even older than they'd previously thought. The sword is now dated at over 1,500 years old. The sword is 33 inches long, and despite it being extremely old, some metal and wood still remain on the weapon. It's not entirely clear how the sword ended up in the lake, but there are some theories. Some think there may have once been a burial site in the vicinity of where the sword was found, while others think the sword could have been an offering or sacrifice to some spirit or deity in the lake. But nothing has been confirmed, and for now, the sword's origins remain a mystery. 5. $1 million asteroid. On February 15, 2013, an asteroid weighing over 1,000 pounds was pulled out of Lake Chabarkal in Chelyabinsk, Russia by a team of divers. The meteorite was nearly a meter across, but it was just a chunk of the original asteroid that was likely about 56 feet wide. The whole meteorite exploded and broke apart as it rammed through Earth's atmosphere at hypersonic speeds, leaving smaller chunks raining down on Russia. In Until this space rock was found, the largest piece recovered only weighed around 24.3 pounds, small enough that one could hold it with both hands. The hunk of meteorite that was discovered in February 2013 is by far the biggest section of the asteroid found yet. According to preliminary tests, the moon rock has extraterrestrial origins. This doesn't mean that it was created by aliens, but that it fell down to Earth from space. Now, you may be wondering, how much is this meteorite worth? Well, smaller pieces of the asteroid were selling for around $30 a gram, so if the moon rock weighs over 1,000 pounds, it would mean that it's worth over $8 million. 4. Foss Lake bodies. In late 2013, highway patrolmen in Custer County, Oklahoma were completing routine training on Foss Lake with their new sonar equipment when they made a shocking discovery. There, at the bottom of the lake, was a car. And oddly enough, there was more than one. The patrolmen found a 1969 Camaro and another 1952 Chevrolet, both of which were heavily caked with mud and grime. The vehicles weren't the most shocking part of the discovery though. Inside the cars were the remains of as many as 6 bodies. Residents living near Foss Lake were stunned to say the least, but the town of Sire felt like the discovery may help them finally close 2 cases involving missing people, and so the remains that were found in the cars were ID'd. In 2013, investigators told CNN and its affiliates COCO and KFOR that one of the cars may have belonged to a teen who disappeared along with 2 of his friends in the year 1970. The other vehicle could be linked to a man that went missing in the 1960s, who, according to a federal official, vanished with one of his friends and his sibling. Daryl Splawn was the diver who first laid eyes on the cars at the bottom of the lake. They were sitting at a depth of 12 feet below the surface, and they were situated about 50 feet from the nearest marina. Daryl, like many others, had no clue how the vehicles, which apparently were found facing different directions, came to be in the lake. The skeletal remains were revealed once the cars were brought to the shore. A year after the gruesome discovery was made, the bodies were finally identified by the Custer County Medical Examiner. In the 1969 Camaro, the remains were determined to belong to 16-year-old Jimmy Williams, 18-year-old Thomas Michael Rios, and 18-year-old Leah Gale Johnson. The bodies found in the 1952 Chevrolet were 58-year-old Nora Marie Duncan, 69-year-old John Alba Porter, and 42-year-old Claybird Hammock, all of whom were confirmed missing in 1969. The decades-old cases regarding missing people from the town of Sale were finally solved. However, it's still a mystery as to how the vehicles got in the lake in the first place. What do you think happened that caused both cars to wind up in Foss Lake? Was it just an accident, or do you think something more sinister took place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying the video so far, be sure to subscribe to the channel. 3. Dino Gang. John Ganshawn and his daughter Lily made an interesting discovery in August of 2017 as they were searching for meteorites in Lake Diefenbaker in Saskatchewan, Canada. No, they didn't find any moon rocks, but they did find a rare fossil. When their search for asteroids didn't work out, Lily asked her father to break open some mud balls she'd found at the lake. What they found in the middle of one of the mud balls was a glowing structure. They had no idea what they were looking at, so they contacted the University of Saskatchewan to help them. Surprisingly, the university confirmed that the mud ball was actually the fossilized remains of a rare ancient mollusk. The Royal Saskatchewan Museum's curator of invertebrate paleontology, Ryan McKellar, told CBC that the type of fossil is one of the very few specimens of that mollusk type found in the area. The last fossil like it was apparently discovered way back in 1963. In order to keep the fossil as preserved as possible, it was donated to the museum. Since they made their first discovery, John and Lily have gone back out to the lake in search of more amazing finds and fossils. Lily has even recruited some of her friends to join in the hunt for rare artifacts, and they call themselves the Dino Gang. 2. Underwater Stonehenge. A peculiar stone structure was discovered at the bottom of Lake Michigan in 2007, while a research team was scouring the body of water looking for the remains of sunken ships. The odd arrangement of rocks was found at a depth of almost 40 feet by professors of underwater archaeology Mark Holley and Brian Abbott from the Northwestern University of Michigan. Holley and Abbott believe that the stone structure, similar to Stonehenge in England, is roughly 9,000 years old. However, one of the stones bears a carving that seems to be in the form of a mastodon, a mammal that went extinct over 10,000 years ago. The exact coordinates of this underwater Stonehenge were kept secret due to the strict conditions of a local Indian tribe that wanted to avoid an influx of curious tourists on their land. The boulder that has the markings is between 3.5 to 4 feet tall, and it's about 5 feet long. Some imprints on the rock could be natural, but the petroglyph depicting a mastodon appears to have human origins, according to Holly. When the underwater formation was shown off to the president of the Underwater Preserve Council, Greg McMaster, he couldn't believe what he was looking at. Now all the researchers need is for experts to definitively confirm whether or not the markings on the boulder area are an ancient petroglyph. The only problem is that the stone with the mastodon print is 40 feet below Lake Michigan, and most experts in petroglyphs don't dive. But if this discovery is found to be 100% authentic, it would mean that the underwater Stonehenge is at least 10,000 years old. Even if the petroglyph is legitimate, it still leaves us with more questions than answers, like who built the stone structure, why did they draw a mastodon on a giant rock, and did humans and mastodons live alongside each other? Unfortunately, until we can get more information about this underwater formation, its origins are still a mystery. 1. Prosthetic Leg. In April 2022, a leg washed up on the shore of Keystone Lake in northeastern Oklahoma. It wasn't a real leg though, it was a prosthetic that someone had lost around 6 months earlier. The people that discovered the leg did their best to find the prosthetic's rightful owner, and finally they found him. Sean Iger told his local news station that the return of his missing leg was life-changing. Sean also shared how he'd lost the leg in the first place. Apparently, he'd visited the lake to enjoy a day out on the water in his kayak. However, something caused his kayak to capsize, and his prosthetic was lost in the process. He said all he could do was watch as his leg floated further and further away from him. Sean was stuck in Keystone Lake for a full 3 hours before he was finally rescued by a passing boat. His main concern at the time was staying alive in the water, not his prosthetic. Sean was forced to get his left leg amputated in 2020 due to a neurological disorder he suffers from. But he never let it stop him. When he lost his prosthetic though, his whole life changed. He'd gotten used to the new leg, and without it he had a really hard time getting around. He couldn't afford a new prosthetic since they cost upwards of $20,000, and he didn't have the insurance to help pay for it. The woman who recovered Sean's leg, Brandy Charles, noticed the prosthetic washed ashore on a Facebook post. When she realized what she was looking at in the picture, she recruited her husband to help her retrieve the leg. Brandy described returning the leg to Sean as an emotional, joyous moment. And if you think about it, this may be the only time in history that someone was thankful to find a leg washed up on the beach. If you were exploring a lake, would you rather find treasure that would allow you to live comfortably for the rest of your life, or a meteorite with properties that could help the human race travel in space? 9. Chris McCandless. In 1992, hunters discovered the decomposed remains of an explorer named Chris McCandless inside an abandoned bus in Alaska. The rusted vehicle, which had long served as a temporary shelter for travelers passing through, was situated north of Denali National Park. There was an SOS note taped to the door, which he'd written at some point after he lost track of the date. An autopsy concluded that McCandless starved to death, but author John Krakauer, who wrote the famous book Into the Wild, suggested that the 24-year-old perished from eating the seeds of a wild potato species called Hedysarum alpinum. Krakauer believes the seeds contained a neurotoxin that inhibits important metabolic processes, essentially causing a person to starve. The discussion surrounding McCandless's death is ongoing and has attracted a cult following of sorts. But some people have taken a bigger interest in the abandoned bus his body was found in, which became a tourist attraction following the young man's widely publicized death. In 2020, state authorities deemed the dilapidated vehicle a public safety hazard and airlifted it elsewhere. The decision came following the death of Veronika Maikamava, a Belarusian tourist who drowned trying to cross the Teglanica River, as well as the rescue of numerous groups of hikers over the years. 8. Pripyat Bus Station. As you may already know, employees of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and their families lived in Pripyat, Ukraine, before they were evacuated amid the nuclear disaster that occurred in 1986. Along with the many left-behind relics of daily life in the Soviet-era closed city is a seemingly futuristic bus station that's become paradoxically overgrown and reclaimed by wildlife. Located just off the main road near the city's entrance, roughly 93 miles outside of Kyiv, the station served as a major transit hub during Pripyat's construction and growth. It also functioned as an important link between Ukraine and Belarus. The stop experienced its busiest day ever, roughly 2 years before the Chernobyl disaster in 1984, when 52 buses passed through in one day while traveling along 14 different routes. It closed abruptly after the nuclear accident and before the mass evacuation took place. When the evacuation took place, it was done using buses from elsewhere due to concerns about nearby buses being contaminated with dangerously high levels of radiation. The buses that came to pick up Pripyat's residents formed a line nearly 16 miles long, and in less than 3 hours, each and every remaining inhabitant who hadn't found some other way to leave Pripyat was on a bus and on their way out of the city. Like the rest of Pripyat, the station has remained shuttered since the evacuation. Today, the station's interior still features a map of bus routes that once crossed through the area. The building is filled with crumbling ticket counters and empty lockers, and its walls are covered with peeling wallpaper and cracked paint. It will never reopen, which means that it will only continue to deteriorate until or unless it's eventually torn down. 7. Abandoned bus blocks the road. While driving down a remote road in Kent, England, in the dead of night in 2022, a motorist encountered an abandoned bus parked horizontally across the road. The bus was blocking traffic from passing through. The bizarre sight was captured by the driver's dashcam during his drive home from work, which suggests that he'd traveled this route before and didn't run into this problem. In the video, a van could be seen approaching the bus from the other side of the road and doing a U-turn. The driver who captured the clip theorized that the bus got stuck while trying to maneuver onto the narrow road from a side street. With no other options, the motorist did a U-turn and took another route home. He told Kent Online that he didn't call emergency services, but a police spokesperson confirmed to the newspaper that they'd responded to a call about a single vehicle accident along the road that night. And while that solved the mystery, it did little to make the discovery seem less eerie. What would you do if this happened to you? Tell us in the comments below and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 6. China's elevated bus. The concept of an elevated bus that straddles the roadway and carries commuters over traffic dates at least as far back as the 1960s. But it hasn't come to fruition yet, although some countries have experimented with the idea. In the early 2000s, plans were made for a prototype to be designed and built in Beijing's Montugao district, with an original due date of 2010. But the project met with numerous delays and eventually fell through. A pilot project was slated to begin with the development of a prototype in Quihangdao by mid-2016. The cities of Nanyang, Shenyang, Tianjin, and Zhuhai also signed on to the pilot project. A 72-foot-long prototype known as the Transit Elevated Bus was unveiled that year in Quihangdao as planned. Its test run in the city was met with high praise, with critics lauding the innovative new vehicle as a groundbreaking new way of getting people from point A to point B without disrupting traffic on the road. But it didn't quite work out as planned, and it wasn't long before experts were questioning the viability of the project. They wondered how much weight the vehicle was actually capable of carrying, how long its battery would last, and how it would maneuver around corners and fit beneath pedestrian bridges. The project took another downturn in early 2017, when several of the people involved were arrested on suspicion of investment fraud. 4 months, the prototype sat on its testing track in the city gathering dust. It was finally dismantled and removed in July of that year. Other municipalities, including the Brazilian city of Manaus, have toyed with the idea of developing a straddling bus. But these ideas have all failed to come to fruition, and for now the concept remains little more than an imaginary vision. 5. Tottenville Bus Graveyard. Most people think of New York City as a bustling, thriving metropolis that lives up to its ultra-modern reputation in almost every way. But if you travel to the very last stop along the Staten Island Railroad, you'll discover a surprisingly quiet, suburban-esque part of the Big Apple that's not featured in brochures or part of any guided tours. If you venture away from the station and a little further into the Tottenville neighborhood, you may come across a graveyard filled with decades-old buses that once transported commuters in much busier parts of the city. A writer from the abandoned NYC website wrote about the collection of dilapidated buses in 2017. They declined to say exactly where the property is located out of respect for the owner, who doesn't sound too keen on welcoming explorers onto the site. In fact, the explorer received a stern warning from the neighbor, who cautioned them against trespassing onto the property. The buses, which reportedly date as far back as the 1960s, appear extremely worn and graffiti-covered in photos that the blogger shared. While it's unclear whether they're still at the site, the writer revealed one key clue about their location, stating that the vehicles were found near a deserted industrial area known as Sharad Shoreline, where old bricks imprinted with the names of their manufacturers still litter the ground. 4. Cork Abandoned Bus Graveyard. In West Cork, Ireland, there's a bus graveyard filled with hundreds of old, rusting buses from all over Ireland and the United Kingdom. Very few people even knew the site existed until recent years, when it appeared on the abandoned West Cork Instagram page. Even then, the person who posted the photos kept the exact location of the graveyard a secret because it's on private property. The images on AWC's page were accompanied by a caption explaining that there are around 260 abandoned buses at the site, along with 20 or so fire engines. And despite having insider intel on the property, the account holder was so fascinated with the bus graveyard that they took hundreds of pictures, which show row upon row of disused commuter buses, double-decker tour buses, and even some work vehicles. They're in various states of disrepair. Some have shattered windshields and are covered in rust, while others are in slightly better shape. Most of the buses appear to be mostly gutted of their interior furnishings, and some have holes in the roof and are falling apart to the point where their suspensions have given way and their bumpers are resting on the ground. 3. Bus Garage Number 7. In a residential area on the outskirts of Kyiv, Ukraine, there's a UFO-shaped Soviet-era building known simply as Bus Garage Number 7. It's filled with colorful, rusting Volvo buses from before the Iron Curtain fell, offering a rare glimpse into daily life in the Eastern Bloc. Construction on the garage began in 1973, according to a former employee who spoke to CNN Travel in 2019. It took 8 years to build the intergalactic-looking station, which the former worker described as the most beautiful bus park in Ukraine and Europe at the time. The building's roof was suspended by 180 steel cables, which were attached to a column in the center. Bus Garage Number 7 serviced various international routes throughout Eastern Europe, including to and from Moldova, Czechoslovakia, Germany, and Poland. During the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster in 1986, more than 70 buses were dispatched from the station to evacuate residents from the city of Pripyat. Some of the buses never returned because they absorbed too much radiation to continue operating safely, and instead ended up at designated graveyards for contaminated vehicles. All the station's international routes were cancelled when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Around the same time, Ukraine descended into a financial crisis that lasted for years to come, and the bus activity decreased even more. With no money to replace the aging buses, most of the remaining domestic routes were cancelled in 2005. The station officially closed in 2015, but by then, activity there had nearly completely ground to a halt. Today, the effects of time and neglect are evident as the overgrown, seemingly post-apocalyptic station falls further into disrepair. 2. Buster, the abandoned bus dog. In 2016, an adorable Staffordshire Terrier was found alone on a London bus. The pup was so distressed that he refused to move, even when concerned passengers tried to coax him away from the seat he was left to fend for himself in. He spent the night planted firmly in place, but he couldn't stay there forever. People were quick to assume that the dog, whom they nicknamed Buster, had been abandoned by a negligent owner, but that turned out not to be the case at all. He had a loving family who had unintentionally become separated from him, It's unclear how this happened, but Buster's guardians certainly didn't dump him off like it seemed at first. They told the press that they took him outside and he disappeared in just a split second. Household members searched frantically for their beloved canine companion, but couldn't find him anywhere. The family became worried sick about their dog and began to fear that they would never see him again. When news about him being spotted on the bus began to circulate, they were overjoyed to the point of tears. The two parties were soon reunited, and Buster, whose real name is Boston, was back in the comfort and safety of his home. 1. Rotherham Bus Depot. Located in South Yorkshire, England, the old market town of Rotherham is home to an abandoned first bus depot that looks much older than it actually is. Built in 1982, the 183,000 square foot site housed cleaning and maintenance facilities, as well as offices and a cafeteria for drivers, administrative staff and employees. During its heyday, the depot housed 80 buses and accommodated around 230 drivers. Plans to close the property were first announced in 2016 when it became too large for the company's needs. It closed the following year and has remained abandoned ever since. Today, the facility is under the care and ownership of the South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority, or SYMCA. But it's reportedly more of an inconvenience to its new owner than anything else, and has been plagued by theft and vandalism ever since its abandonment in 2017. While there appear to be no actual buses inside, it's not hard to tell what the building was once used for. What was once a repair shop is now filled with the crumbling remnants of bus repair bays, while another area contains bus cleaning machines and other maintenance supplies. There's a bus mural on one of the garage walls, and old offices filled with chairs and other items that were left behind. The ongoing issues with the disused site have racked up annual security and maintenance bills to the tune of 6 figures, making the depot a lot more expensive than it's worth. It has a handful of uses, including as a police firearms training facility, where urban explorers have found spent shell casings, as well as a COVID testing site. In early 2022, after years of failing to lease the property, SYMCA announced plans to sell it, regardless of whether or not doing so will require the demolition of the structure that's currently in place. For now, it remains standing, but if things go the owner's way, it'll be someone else's problem in the near future.
Number 8. Camp Century. As the looming prospect of nuclear war with the Soviet Union intensified during the 1950s, the United States Army entertained the idea of building a hidden network of missile storage and launch sites beneath the Greenland ice sheet. To determine whether this was feasible, the Army launched a top-secret problem called Project Iceworm. The operation was kept secret even from Denmark, which ruled Greenland at the time. As a cover-up, the US deceived the Danish government into thinking that the military was carrying out a different research project. That project was called Camp Century, with the goal of building affordable ice cap outposts in northwestern Greenland. Engineers dug 21 trenches and nearly 2 miles of tunnels and filled the space with pre-made buildings, including a hospital, theater, shop, church, and housing for the 200 military members who lived at the clandestine base. The project hit a snag when ice core data revealed that the glacier the base was built on was traveling much faster than anyone had initially realized. The tunnels and stations would likely be destroyed within 2 years. For this and other reasons, including Denmark's suspicions about what was really going on at the base, Project Iceworm was cancelled in 1965 and Camp Century was abandoned. The Army assumed that the site would remain frozen in the ice forever and left behind dangerous biological, radioactive, and chemical waste. But as we know today, glaciers are melting at unprecedented rates. A 2016 study concluded that if the waste isn't cleaned up by the year 2100, it'll start leaking into the surrounding environment. In 2019, Danish scientist Nana Carlson told the BBC that the base was still 62 miles from the glacier's edge. The good news is that there's time to clean it up. The bad news is that experts don't know how much time because the ice is melting rapidly. Number 7. The Dein Bunker. In 1959, construction began on a top-secret 4-story underground bunker near Ottawa, Ontario, Canada's capital city. It was meant to house the country's top government and military officials in the event of a nuclear war. Named the Dein Bunker after then Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, it was designed to accommodate a little over 500 occupants for a month while enabling them to continue running the country from underground. The clandestine facility was built on a former farm in a valley located relatively close to downtown Ottawa, making it an ideal place for leaders to retreat on short notice. From start to finish, construction on the 100,000 square foot shelter took less than 18 months. The Dein Bunker operated as a Canadian Forces station from 1961 to 1964. It was manned 24 hours a day by 100 to 150 staff members and facilitated some of Canada's most classified communications at the time. Today, the bunker looks just as it did at the height of the Cold War. It's open to the public, offering visitors a first-hand look at its war room, the Prime Minister's bedroom, sleeping quarters for other officials and staff members, washrooms, offices, machine rooms, the kitchen, the cafeteria, exercise and activity areas, and more. Number 6. Camp XRay. Chances are you've heard of the infamous detention camp at the Guantanamo Bay U.S. Naval Station in southeastern Cuba. The military prison at the base opened shortly after the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center towers in 2001. Part of the site, known as Camp XRay, has surprisingly different origins. Built during the 1990s, it was meant for housing immigrants who were denied asylum in the U.S. During the mid-90s, more than 100,000 Cuban asylum seekers were approved to move to America. Those who ended up at Camp XRay, known as excludables, were sent back to Cuba. After 9/11, Camp XRay was repurposed as a temporary detention facility while the military built a longer-term facility nearby. The more permanent prison was meant to be temporary, but Camp XRay was meant to be even more temporary. Suspected Taliban and Al-Qaeda soldiers were brought there from Afghanistan and locked in tiny cages measuring roughly 8 square feet. They languished for roughly 3 months before Camp XRay was shut down, and the prisoners were moved to the newly built facility known as Camp Delta. As detainees began to file complaints, which included allegations of horrific abuse by guards, the military was court-ordered to preserve any evidence of how prisoners were treated at Guantanamo. Plans to raise Camp XRay were therefore halted, and the site was simply left to rot. It wasn't long before the harsh tropical climate began to take its toll, leaving the site overgrown and filled with rotting plywood guard towers and other temporary structures. The prison at Guantanamo was never exactly a secret, but most of what went on there was, including inexcusable torture, humiliation, and violence against suspects at the hands of the CIA and the American military. Camp Delta has also been closed down, and nobody is allowed to tour the abandoned property. Number 5. Harp Research Station. The High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, or HARP, is in a remote part of Alaska called Gakona. It was established in 1993 as a collaborative effort between the U.S. Army, the U.S. Air Force, and the University of Alaska. It was designed for researching the ionosphere, the region spanning between 50 and 600 miles above the Earth, for potential radio communications and surveillance developments. The HARP station is equipped with a high-powerful frequency transmitter, a collection of 180 antennas, and other devices that are used for measuring and observing activity in the ionosphere. Two of the facility's biggest goals are to develop VLF, or very low frequencies, and ELF, or extremely low frequencies, for communication with submarines. To some, the dozens of antennas resemble oversized television antennas, and while most people accept the explanation that the station is a research facility, many have jumped on the bandwagon with various conspiracy theories surrounding the site, including the possibilities that the antennas are a weather control device, a mind control device, a space weapon, or a death ray. After all, why would the HARP facility be located in such a remote area if there wasn't any deep, dark secrets behind it? As it turns out, there's a simple explanation. In order for the equipment to work, it needs to be located in an auroral region. Alaska is the only place in the US that qualifies. The equipment also needs a quiet electromagnetic location, which further explains the location. Officially speaking, the HARP station is not qualified, but officials have admitted in past interviews that they conduct defensive research there, and it's not exactly open to the public. In 2015, the US Air Force vacated the base due to a lack of funding. It was turned over to the University of Alaska and remains in operation under its new civilian staff. Number 4. Fort Dietrich. Shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in late 1941, the American government bought a collection of 5 large farms encompassing a 1,200-acre tract of land in Maryland. In 1943, the property known as Fort Dietrich became the birthplace of the U.S. Army Biological Warfare Laboratories, where scientists carried out intensive biological warfare research. Run by the Army's Chemical Warfare Service, these experiments were carried out under the same level of secrecy that was afforded to the Manhattan Project, which saw the development of the atomic bomb. Staff members worked with extremely dangerous pathogens, including anthrax. Throughout World War II, 5,000 bombs containing anthrax spores were produced at the site. The first public inklings of the biological weapons research that went on at Fort Detrick came in 1946. These activities nevertheless continued, and the facilities were actually expanded in the early 1950s. During the 1950s, scientists infamously performed disturbing experiments on human subjects as part of Operation Whitecoat. Most of the volunteers were Seventh-day Adventists who were conscientious objectors, meaning they were religiously opposed to fighting in a war. The trials at Fort Detrick were offered to them as an alternative to participating in armed service after regular recruits became suspicious of the experiments and refused to go forward without more information about what was going to be done to them. During that same decade, 2 workers at Fort Detrick died from anthrax exposure, and in 1964, an employee died from viral encephalitis. Later on in the Cold War, researchers at the base shifted their primary focus from offensive biological weapons to infectious disease research. Various types of biological research continue at the site today, and Fort Detrick is no longer a secret. Although parts of it are open to the public, other sections remain off limits to visitors. At number 3, Weingut 1. As World War II entered its later stages in 1944 and began turning largely in favor of the Allies, the Nazis attempted to build a network of underground bunkers and tunnels in the Upper Bavaria region that could withstand bombing campaigns. The idea came after an intensive, wide-scale Allied attack on Germany's factories and industrial sites. The Third Reich's vision for the covert facility included plans for a partially underground 9-story factory for building jet engines that would remain hidden from view with plants and soil. Known as Weingut 1, construction on the top-secret facility began in 1944 in the remote wilderness outside Munich. By then, the Allies had already seized Germany's airspace, making it nearly impossible to build the site unnoticed. As the Nazis' grip on the war continued to loosen, it became clear that they would never be able to finish Weingut 1 in time for it to benefit them in any meaningful way. But the Germans continued building in a frenzied attempt to meet the project's ambitious 6-month construction deadline. Most of the work was done by forced laborers. Out of the roughly 10,000 workers at the site, more than 8,500 of them were enslaved prisoners. More than 3,000 laborers were cruelly worked to death, starved to death, or were murdered, or otherwise perished from the brutal treatment they endured at the hands of the Nazis. American forces discovered the project and captured aerial images of it, but they decided not to bomb it, possibly because they may have known that there was a forced labor camp nearby. The Americans were also pretty confident that there was no way Weingut 1 would be finished by the time the Allies defeated Germany, so they saw no reason to destroy it. In fact, the construction may have benefited U.S. forces by keeping German troops distracted from other more important things. By the time the U.S. Army took over the site in 1945, 7 of the bunker's 12 planned arched sections had been built. 2 years later, in 1947, the military demolished all but one section, which still stands today as a forlorn testament to the atrocities of war. Number 2. Beav Vinka. During the 1960s, the Soviet Union established a top-secret submarine base and military town called Beav Vinka, located on the Kamchatka Peninsula in the country's Far East region. The remote settlement consisted of 8 apartment buildings. There was a kindergarten and school, a hostel, a post office, a grocery store, and a club for entertainment. The military installations consisted of barracks, storage facilities, a commandant's office, a headquarter building, a diesel substation, and a fuel warehouse. There was no overland route to Beav Vinka, and it had no airstrip. The only way to get there was by boat or helicopter. The base got almost everything it needed, including food, mail, and equipment from a weekly supply ship. It was Beav Vinka's only connection to the outside world. Like many other Soviet military sites, the base closed down shortly after the Soviet Union fell. Residents packed up and relocated, leaving behind a ghost town. Today, Beav Vinka remains much like it was left, minus the toll that time and the elements have taken on it. Because of its remoteness and the difficulty of reaching it, the property's remaining structures have spared largely from vandalism and other human-related damage. The ruins consist of rusting ships and derelict buildings filled with personal belongings that people left behind, including toys, newspapers, equipment manuals, textbooks, children's drawings, and furniture. And at number 1, Ericon Air Station. Roughly 1,200 miles southwest of Anchorage, Alaska, in the Bering Sea, there's a tiny island called Henge. Located on the western tip of the Aleutian Islands archipelago, it measures a little over 2 miles wide and 4 miles long. This far-flung landmass is home to an active U.S. Air Force airport called Ericon Air Station. It opened in 1943 as Henge Air Force Base after Army Air Force engineers were tasked with building a runway big enough for B-29 Superfortress bombers. They ended up building a 10,000-foot landing strip and 2 5,000-foot cross runways. After the war, the military abandoned the base almost entirely. They left behind an array of aircraft wrecks, decaying buildings, and vehicles that were no longer needed now that the conflict was over. Henge was put back into use during the Korean War and once again became inactive afterward. Military operations resumed again in 1958, and the airport saw commercial use on and off over the years. During the 1970s, the base became home to a ballistic missile radar system called Cobra Dane. Its main function was to gather intelligence. Henge was also briefly used as an anti-ballistic missile testing site. In 1994, it was closed as an active Air Force station, but its airport continues to operate as a refueling station and a diversionary airport. Although Henge technically isn't a secret, not many people know about it, and very few civilians ever see it. At the very least, its desolate and distant location only makes it natural for one to assume that it was meant to be kept hidden from the public. Thanks for watching. Which one of these secret military bases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.